Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. I'm Ayasoma, as you probably know, and you probably know Bhante Sudaso here to my right. And you should know, if you don't know her already, now you will. Venerable Chanda, currently visiting here at Empty Cloud Monastery. It's delightful to have you here. So for those who are not familiar with Venerable Chanda, she is an awesome bhikkhuni from England, and she is the founder of Anukampa Bhikkhuni Project. So she's currently opening a Bhikkhuni monastery. She's in the work. It's all in the works in England. The first Bhikkhuni monastery in the UK, and hopefully the first of many in the UK and in Europe as well. All right. So during monk chat, you're always welcome to ask any questions that you might have, and that also counts for the residents here. Tineri is smiling. She she likes to ask questions. And welcome to Rick, Geeta, Kumu, Mary, Kelly, Patricia, all the friends who are joining in and not yet saying hello. And we can start by taking Rick's question that says, frequently I feel inspired to deeply study Buddhism. That's great. Other times I feel so saturated by all I have learned, I can't absorb anymore. What I need is noble silence, minimal sensory stimulation, and the stillness of meditation. Can you share some reflections on honoring these needs? Venerable Chanda.
Yeah. I think that quite often, maybe because we come from predominantly Western cultures, we have a great respect and thirst for knowledge and for information. And this is wonderful to help establish a sense of right view and right perspective about the practice, and to get some idea about what it is that attracts you to the Dhamma. But I think the danger can be that we don't take the time to actually absorb and integrate the teachings, and we can tend to have a kind of insatiable thirst to know more. So it's very good that you're coming to the point where you feel it's time to start experiencing some of the things that the Buddha promises and points towards. And the other danger, I think, is that sometimes we can think that we need perfect conditions in order to practice. And very few of us, even who live at monasteries, have entirely perfect, conducive conditions all the time. But we do have enough. If you have food, if you have shelter, if you have reasonable health, then you already have the opportunity to practice. So I would suggest creating a space in your home, even if you don't have a separate room. It could be a place in your bedroom or a place in a quiet room in the house. I know that some of my supporters don't even have more than, say, a kitchen, dining room and a bedroom. So they just carve like a little corner of one of those rooms, and they make it, they use it only for meditation. Yeah. So what you could do is put your cushion there, make it comfortable, or a chair, put some objects of reverence, maybe a little Buddha statue or pictures of teachers or people who inspire you, who embody certain qualities. And keep that as your sacred place. And the next thing I say about establishing a regular practice is not to be too ambitious, first of all, but to make the regularity important. So it doesn't have to be for a whole hour every day or an hour morning and evening, but it could be just for 10 minutes in the morning before you have your breakfast, 10 minutes in the evening. But it's important to start learning how to stop and just enjoy this sense of peace and quiet and an opportunity to go inside and have a look at what's happening in your own mind. Because really the Buddhist path is inviting you to taste the Dhamma for yourself, to come and see it for yourself, and to see if what the Buddha is actually teaching makes sense to you and helps you on the way. So they're just a few reflections. And of course, if you can get together with friends and have a regular sitting group or something like this, or if you can take some time on retreat, you could come to a monastery like Empty Cloud when they're not on retreat themselves, or you could go to retreat centres and do a shorter retreat so that you have very specialised conditions, so you're not needing to be involved in your normal worldly activities. So there's a few tips. And I think, once you have the motivation to practice, the conditions, you will find them. Otherwise, you will create them. So best of luck with that.
Great. Thank you, Venerable. And another question from Rick. Maybe I'll pass it on to Bhante this time. Does the Buddha offer any guidance on how to care for grandchildren when their parents are overtaken by addiction?
Not specifically. We can't think of anywhere where the Buddha talks about that specific of a condition. But just generally speaking, the duties of a parent apply. If you're a grandparent and you're in the position of looking after grandchildren, then you would still use the same duties of a parent to a child. So the duties of teaching them morality, establishing them in a commitment to kindness and compassion and generosity, teaching them wisdom. So doing what you can to establish them in a good heart, a wholesome heart, and also being there for them, because it's actually very challenging. So if you're the child of a parent who has any kind of severe behavioral problem, so whether it's addiction or another kind of behavioral problem, that can be very challenging for the child. They're usually aware on some level that something's not right, but they usually don't really know what to do about it. So do what you can to be of support to the child. And also watch out for opportunities to help out the parents as well, to see if there's ways that you can, if they don't realize their addiction is a problem, see if you can find ways to communicate to them that it is. If they're interested in getting help with overcoming their addiction, help them get with what help they need. I also highly recommend talking to addiction specialists and ask them for their advice, because this is exactly the kind of things that they're used to working with. So talk to addiction counselors, talk to social workers. These are the sorts of situations that they specialize in. So the Buddhist teachings are more general, but for something that's specific, I would recommend talking to specialists. Again, addiction counselors and social workers. This is what they're specialized in helping with.
Great, thank you, Venerable. And there's lots of appreciation and happiness that Venerable Chanda is here with us tonight. She's currently visiting Empty Cloud for the past week. She's been here actually, not participating in the live streams because she needs a good break since she's been working hard. Not because we didn't want her to share Dhamma. She's an excellent Dharma teacher, but just because to give her a little break. But you can check out the Anukampa YouTube video, as well as not YouTube video, YouTube channel where it has YouTube videos. And you can listen to plenty of Dhamma, Venerable Chanda there, as well as actually on our channel. So 2 years ago she came to share a retreat, so there's still recordings on the channel somewhere. And also on Facebook, for friends tuning in on Facebook, you can check out Anukampa's Facebook page, and I think you're supposed to like it or follow it or whatever.
Only if you do like it genuinely. Otherwise it's not Buddhist.
You should like it and follow it, like in reality, like both virtually and really. And there are wonderful. Okay, so Jordan says, is there any situation where you can harm or kill someone if they try to kill you or someone first? Much love to you as well. Thank you, Jordan. No. No, killing is a big no-no, never a good idea. And harming also big no-no, never a good idea. There is, though, it's worth mentioning, a sort of not quite an exception, so I don't want to give you a leeway, but an understanding for self-defense. So, but keeping in mind what is our intention? Is our intention to, if we happen, if someone attacks us and then in self-defense we harm them, as long as our intention is not harming them, but getting out of danger, then it's not an offense in the monastic code, if I'm correct, right? Which I believe that applies probably definitely for lay people as well. So we obviously don't want to get into dangerous situations voluntarily, but in case we find ourselves in dangerous situations, we also don't want to. There's no martyrdom in Buddhism, so we don't want to go like, oh yes, please, do whatever you want with this body and mind. No, we want to get out of there as soon as possible. But also, obviously, ideally, without wanting too much harm for the person involved that is harming us either. Of course, if that happens, well, we also can forgive ourselves for that. It's perfectly human. But yeah, getting out of it. And if it happens that we're harming that person, once again, remembering that our intention was not to harm them, but to get out of danger. And I don't know if the Venerables have anything to add on that.
Yeah, one thing I would add is just that if you really are in that situation, maybe to recognize that by, say, pushing a person away, you're actually protecting them too from breaking their own sila. So I remember quite early on in my practice, one of my teachers in Nepal said to me, we lock our rooms here, not because we're sort of covetous for the things we have or because we're afraid of losing things because, there's nothing much to steal, but we do that to prevent others stealing. So in that sense, if you think of it as a protection for yourself and for the other person, I think it's likely to undermine the force that you need to use as well. So that's another perspective.
And also emphasizing what Ayasoma said about avoiding dangerous situations in the first place. It's actually in the Sabbasava Sutta. So the Sabbasava Sutta gives a lot of really practical advice. And one of the bits of advice is the Buddha says to avoid dangerous situations. Because in dangerous situations, then your defilements might be strengthened. And this is one example. If you willingly go into a dangerous place where people are more likely to attack you, well, you're actually creating the conditions where you might get angry or your violent urges might rise to the surface. So it's usually better to avoid those kinds of situations if you can. So it's kind of like, oh, I only fight in self-defense, but then you willingly go into a place where people are going to attack you. It's like, well, is that really only in self-defense or what's going on there?
Yeah, always getting back to the intention is always a good idea. And Kumo says, why is that the mind arising from the body sense organ, kaya vijnana, can only sense pleasurable and painful feelings, but not neutral feelings like the other four sense organs? Any one of the two?
I have no idea what she's talking about. As far as I know, all of the senses can perceive the three kinds of feeling. Do you have you ever heard this?
No, I felt the same. I think that every sense door, including the mind, which is one of the six senses, can experience the whole spectrum of unpleasant all the way to pleasant. And so neutral is somewhere in between, but there might be many shades of neutral also. And I think it's only when the mind is fairly dull and unaccustomed to those experiences that we tend to think there's nothing happening. But in reality, there is something always happening. There's always going to be a so-called feeling tone or affective quality of Vedana, so long as there's contact to any one of the six sense doors. So it's sometimes a matter of sharpening up the mindfulness and just learning to tune in to what's happening. And the more that mindfulness becomes empowered and bright, the more you will actually start to see there. So,
yeah.
Great, thank you, Venerables. And Bhavani has a specific question, I believe, for you, since she says, how was your experience in India, Venerable Anukampa? Well, Anukampa is her project.
I like being called Venerable Anukampa. That's a great name.
Yeah.
Something to live up to.
Yeah. Right.
So thank you. Yes. Well, my experience in India was many things, but the most pertinent thing for me is that it's the land where I discovered the Dhamma for the first time. And so it was at once both very adventurous and part of a huge kind of life journey, but also that's where I came in contact with the Buddha's teachings. And so from the first retreat that I sat with S.N. Goenka at the time in Vipassana retreats, it felt as though finally somebody was speaking to my heart and making clear in words and through teachings truths that I'd always intuited to be true, but could never quite put my finger on. So, for example, in my teens, I went through a period of really questioning like the purpose of my life or why I'm here. But even more than that, whether it was actually worth the energy involved in living and the suffering involved in living just for mundane accomplishments. Even though everyone around me and in my family had fairly decent lives, fairly comfortable lives, it just felt a little bit lacking in a sense of true meaning, and also in the sense of a response to the suffering that I could hear about in the news, right? Even if I wasn't experiencing it myself. The news was full of talk about wars. I think at that time it was the Falklands, is that right? I forget now. And the greed that you hear about, the power, etc. And I just felt this really strong sense of disillusionment and almost repulsion from the world. So when I went to India, one of the first things I noticed was that people had a sense that there is something more, and more than this material reality. And then, of course, I found the path. You know, I found meditation, and for the first time in my life, I had an opportunity to really look inside at what was going on in my body and mind. So later, of course, India's continued to be incredibly relevant to me now that I'm getting more and more into the sutta-based Buddhism and the sutta-based practice, because the Buddha taught in that land. That's where he discovered the Dhamma and taught it, you know. And since ordaining as a bhikkhuni, I had the great fortune to go on pilgrimage there with Ajahn Brahmali, one of my teachers, and four bhikkhunis altogether. So I was one of four. And we got to go to all the holy sites, you know, the place that the Buddha was born, was enlightened, started to teach the Dhamma, and also where he entered parinibbana. And so it was incredibly special for me to be in India as a bhikkhuni and to realize that I was basically part of keeping his inheritance alive. So India is a very special land, I think. And I think perhaps today it's becoming a little bit more influenced by capitalism and neoliberalism, like most places in the world. But it's still a land where many experiments are done for the purification of mind. So I always feel immensely grateful to India and to the people of that land.
Thank you, Venerable. Thank you for sharing. And Patricia from Cork also wants to know what are the latest news on the wonderful Anukampa Bhikkhuni project.
Okay, I'll be truly honest. The latest news is that I'm an empty cloud and I'm with a wonderful brother and sister who are giving me complete rest, except for promoting it on my behalf and letting me have a little break. So I think basically after 6 years of really hard work, starting off with absolutely nothing other than the intention and the wish to create something for bhikkhunis where women can come and actually train from scratch. We've established a good support network. We have gratefully received the generosity of many people all over the world, to the point where we're almost ready to purchase suitable property should it arise. But also after 6 years, I'm very tired, and it's time for me to really deepen my practice and take a little rest, and also reconnect with fellow monastics, because I've been pretty much outside of community for 6 years. Normally I go and spend my Vasa in Perth with Ajahn Brahm, which is absolutely wonderful and very nourishing. But of course, during the pandemic, that was no longer an opportunity. Western Australia is ironically the most closed off part of the world. So at the moment, I'm enjoying the company of monastic siblings and getting some spiritual nourishment for myself, in the hope that I can come back and serve with more resilience, with more perseverance or long-term sustenance, let's say, and from a deeper place of practice. So, but please be involved and keep up with what we're doing. Yeah, and eventually, hopefully, many of you can come and visit as well, including these two venerables.
Sadhu, we're very happy that Venerable Chanda is taking care of her practice. It's very good. And it's lovely to have her here at Empty Cloud. So Sud asks, Dear Venerables, how does one keep a mind of loving kindness continuously? I often find that I make a determination each day, but maybe this lasts a few hours. How do you keep it going longer without forgetting? Wow, a loving kindness for a few hours? That's incredible.
Yeah. I actually remember when I was a Samanera and I was first trying to get some proficiency with metta meditation. I remember going to my preceptor and saying, "Oh, Ajahn, this is amazing. I was able to do metta for 30 seconds." And he was like, "Yes, keep going." And this was a real accomplishment. Actually, keeping a mind of loving kindness for 30 consecutive seconds. That was incredible. I've never done that, possibly ever in my life. So actually, if you can go for several hours, I have to say that's amazing. You're doing really, really, really well. But actually, as for reminders, one thing which I found really useful, and this might sound a little bit cheesy, but it really works. So what I would do is I would make little like notes that said metta, and I would stick them all over. So like when I would like open the cabinet, there'd be a sign there that said metta. When I would go to the door of my room, there'd be a sign that said metta. I'm actually staying in a room called metta right now, which is great. I'm staying in the metta room. Like when I would open my desk, there would be a little note that said metta. So there'd be all these little reminders throughout my day, reminding me to bring up a mind of metta. So you might try that. But actually just whenever it comes to mind, just start practicing metta. Whenever it occurs to you, just keep bringing it up. And gradually it becomes the habit of the mind. So keep at it. It sounds like you're already doing pretty well. Just keep at it. Those are my thoughts anyway.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Bante. And Fishbowl Mand, cute nickname, says, I was not raised around Buddhism, but I would like to share the Dhamma with my young children. Would the Venerables at Empty Cloud or Anukampa consider some short online classes aimed toward kids? I'll be quite honest here. Both Bante Siddhas and myself are just terrible with children. I won't go around it. So we're good with older children, so 19 and above.
Like us.
Yes. But it's, historically, Bante has tried to teach dependent origination to young children, and it wasn't very successful. So I would encourage, once again, the Sri Lankan Buddhist Viharas, on the other hand, they have excellent children's programs that these days are online. So if you're far away, you might actually be able to join them. Even maybe Bhante Sanata Vihari actually does a children's program with his Vihara in California. So maybe you can write to him and ask him if actually he's going to lead our next Thursday live stream, so you can actually ask that question to him right there. And I'm sure that he will be able, if not through his Zoom like online class, he can point you in the right direction. And I'm not sure if at Anukampa you do children's offerings yet?
No, it's really interesting because there is a bhikkhu in England, a monk in England, who invited me to talk about my life as a nun. And then about a year later, somebody wrote to me saying, oh, we've been directed to you by this venerable because he says that you're experienced and very good at teaching children. I thought, oh, really? I've never taught children before in my life either. But only one thing I would add, because I wouldn't be, averse to trying. I think as long as the children are coming with the willingness and the genuine interest, I think there can be a danger in, especially if you're a Buddhist parent, in bringing the children to teachings and asking them to sit down and be still, because then they might, depending on the child, develop a bit of an aversion. It becomes another thing that my mum and dad want me to do. So I think with the Dhamma, to be honest, maybe this is as a convert Buddhist, not a born Buddhist, it's most powerful when we come to it through some appreciation of suffering, or perhaps some appreciation of the joy of meditation. But it's something that's sort of taken light within our hearts. It's something that we're motivated to do by ourselves, and then I think it can be much more profound. Having said that, I know that Ajahn Brahm in Australia just encourages parents to bring their children to monasteries, and then he trains his monks to be just very kind with them, and just let them feel that they can run around, they can play, they can just be kids in the monastery, and then they have this very nice association with Buddhism, that this is a fun place to be. So I think that as a first contact can sometimes be enough. So I don't know whether I'm now inviting lots of children to play in your big sala.
We have already.
This
Done
is
there, done that.
sometimes
Yeah,
nice.
that on the other hand is good. It's more of the Dhamma programs that it's specifically for children. But having children at the monastery, that's great. Yeah. I mean, any human and non-human is really welcome at the monastery. And yeah, this being said, I do actually love also the idea of forcing children to study the Dhamma, because in hindsight, my parents made me do so many things that I didn't like when I was an adolescent that now are turning out to be useful. Like, for example, studying ancient Greek and Latin. I would have never, out of my own accord, studied ancient Greek and Latin, thinking that was completely useless, which kind of was, for most of my life, until I became a bhikkhuni and started translating from Pali, and all that knowledge started becoming quite useful. So had my parents forced me to study the Dhamma, I would have been so grateful. Perhaps not while I was doing it, but then when I became an adolescent and was depressed, then I kind of would have had a guide, or maybe not when I was an adolescent sometime, instead of like wandering around and being so confused. So I feel like if you have the opportunity to force your children to study the Buddhist teachings, do it. I mean, Tineri, actually, she had that experience. And what is your Yelp review on that?
Yeah, I was, forced to go when I was younger, to the youth programs. Even there are times where I wanted to go out with my friends, and there was even actually recently, past few months, there was a program that went on during Thanksgiving break, and I had to go to that and cancel my plans with my friends. Over time, there's things that I was able to pick up and stuck with me that helped throughout my daily activities. And so I think there's definitely a great effect for kids going to monasteries, even if they don't want to.
Okay, so Tineri's review is 4.5 stars out of 5. 4 out of 5 for the greatness, and the other half is for the FOMO, for the fear of missing out. But now she's practicing JOMO, the joy of missing out. So she's actually staying at the monastery for 3 months. So that's pretty impressive. A great result, huh? Okay, so Hasanta says, clearly Buddha ordained women. That's correct. Here we are. Some texts were authored by women, and there were leading female Sangha and lay followers. But some differences exist. Rules, Buddhas equals only men, etc. Are they contaminants? Well, this is you open a whole Pandora's box right there. I'll try to do long story short. Well, in terms of the rules, usually we get hung up with this sort of rule thing. And I think there's quite some wrong view that we bring to the table most of the time. And it's usually that we've been primed either by our culture of origin or by some sexism present in either our culture of origin or in other different cultures of origins. And sometimes actually, in people who perhaps have never met bhikkhunis from Theravada countries, but they also haven't really heard too much about bhikkhunis. When they hear that I have more rules, for example, than Bhante Sudato, they're like, oh, that's great, wonderful, that's amazing. And that's because, it's wonderful. We take these rules not because it's a torture, not because we, just want to live in deprivation, but rather they're gifts from the Buddha that help us see our mind and work with our mind. And so, yes, of course, the two, the Bhikkhuni Vinaya is different from the Bhikkhu Vinaya. And there's historical reasons for that. But there's also actually a lot of different rules that we have in addition that protect us from being, distracted in our holy life by, perhaps taking certain roles that have been a little bit pushed on women throughout the centuries and the millennia, actually. So, for example, I can't do the laundry for Bhante Sudato. This is one of my favorites, but he can do the laundry for both of us.
I was needing some washing.
Or we can't fan him and pour him water while he's talking, but he can, for example, do it. See, great, thank you, Bhante Sadhu. So there are all these different rules that we have that obviously are from back at the time of the Buddha. Some were pertinent back then, and some are pertinent to this day. There are some other things here and there that have been crafted. So historians have been working in the past centuries to kind of do the work of stratifying what are the sort of the teachings closest to the actual historical Buddha and what were sort of later developments and commentaries of the 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 commentaries that then can, kind of, it's sort of like the telephone game. The Buddha says one thing and then it kind of is delivered perhaps in a different way. So yeah, there are certain elements that like the Garudhammas, for example, there's tons of books and history and everything that is clearly a later development. It's not even part of the Vinaya, actually. There's some that overlaps, but most of it doesn't. And it's just in one famous sutta that it's clearly juxtaposed. The Buddha is all like, yeah, great. And then, oh, women are a disaster. So there's, we have to deal with the consequences of our past choices, which, probably some were good and some were bad, since, there's not currently a Buddha alive. So, and this is valid for both men and women, 2,500 years, we probably met the Buddha and we're like, and he said, yeah, I'm a great, wonderful being. And we're like, yeah, see you later. But, it is what it is. We still have the teachings and we can still practice them. In terms of the Buddhas being only men, that's, also opinable. But also when we're talking about Buddhas, even if we want to be literalist and not even take into consideration what the scholars have said, it's actually Sammasambuddha that can come in a male form. And well, breaking news, nobody right now can be a Sammasambuddha because a Sammasambuddha comes into being when the teachings are not present anymore. So it's really not something that we should be worrying about right now, because the only option that we have is Anubuddha, and it's a pretty great option. And that is accessible to anyone, any single human being that diligently and earnestly practices the Dhamma. So yeah, I wouldn't get too hung up on all these details, but rather just follow the flavor of liberation. And there's a ton of it, and there's a lot that has been preserved. And whenever we practice that, it's great. And whenever there's stuff that sounds dodgy, well, we can put it on the shelf and maybe take it up at another time, and maybe not. Maybe throw it out. Some of it needs to be thrown out, but it's very little. It's like really, really little. And usually it's in contradiction with core elements of the Dhamma, so it's easy to understand. So actually, I didn't really do long story short. I did long story medium.
Long story long.
All right. Anything else that Venerables want to add?
Yeah, just briefly pointing out again that the statement that Sammasambuddhas are always in male bodies, that's questionable. So that's one line which appears in the suttas only in 2 places that I'm aware of. And there's scholarly research which shows that was probably a later addition. So it's doubtful whether that's something the Buddha actually said. Otherwise, I agree with everything you said.
Okay, and what's on that? Do you want to add anything?
I think it would make sense according to the Dhamma and the Buddha's actual wish, the way that Dhamma has to spread, that a Sammasambuddha would take the form, whatever form was most effective actually to spread the Dhamma. So I think that would depend on the era, on the situation in society at the time. But it's interesting that it's only in a couple of places in the suttas, and yet it's being, regurgitated and promoted again and again. By whom, actually?
Yeah.
Probably not by the bhikkhunis.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's also, once again, a non-problem. So why worry about, we get so concerned about such silly things when we don't even have that option on the table, luckily, because actually that would be really difficult. Can you imagine being in a world without the Dhamma, trying to figure out, like, you actually have to rediscover the Dhamma, do the whole work all by yourself, like you don't even know that you need to cultivate metta. It's horrible. So we can actually, instead of wasting time speculating on what form, what genitalia the Buddha has, the Sammasambuddha has, we can actually just be so grateful that the Sammasambuddha here, Gautama Buddha of this era, actually has done the work for us and given us this incredible inheritance. And Como says, "Dear Venerables, I was surprised to hear that in a Dhamma talk myself." Oh, I believe of the, what was it? The mind being, not being able to experience neutral feelings, it was. Oh. Yeah, so she was confused. I actually had not understood your question, so that's why I passed it on. So great, we're all on the same page.
Yeah, sometimes you hear strange things in Dhamma talks, so it's important to remember that the suttas always come first. So the suttas are the primary source, which means that they take precedent over any secondary source, which includes what you hear in Dhamma talks.
Great. And Patricia appreciates that you're taking care of yourself, Venerable Chanda, and connecting with the Empty Cloud monastics.
Thank you.
We appreciate that too, by the way.
I very much appreciate the kindness with which I've been received.
Oh, sadhu.
You can thank the Buddha for teaching metta.
Yes. Otherwise, we would have to figure that out too, how to receive you.
Some of it would be innate.
And Christine asks, are there any teaching correlates between Buddhism and internal family systems where there is the view of multiple selves? Is the goal to listen and dissolve these selves? I don't understand. Are there any teaching correlating between Buddhism and internal family systems?
I've never heard of internal family systems. Have you heard of this?
Vaguely, very vaguely. So I don't really know it in any depth, and I'd probably not be the person to speak about that system per se, but I think there are many kind of systems that try to look at explaining why we are the way we are. So even you could say astrology is one other way of looking at causal conditions that have created this thing that we take to be a self. for being the way it manifests. And I think it's the same with the internal family systems. It's probably, I mean, I might be wrong here, saying that, you know, we manifest, our sense of self manifests differently depending on our place in the family, or maybe with different family members, or due to conditioning of the ancestors. I imagine it's something like this, but again, I might be wrong. And I think all of that is true to a point, but the danger with these things is that if we're not really looking at conditions with clarity, we can just make even more of a sense of self. So if there are multiple selves arising in the family systems, then, oh, this is me, and this is me, and this is me. Whereas actually we should be saying this aspect that sometimes arises is one way that I fabricate a sense of self. This aspect, or this thing that I take to be a self, is another way that I, you know, mistakenly understand that to be a self. So I think it's more, in Buddhism, we're looking more to deconstruct this apparent self and find out what the causes are for its arising, so that we can then try to put in causes in place so that we can start to unpack some of that. So yeah, the Buddha's teaching is the best. You're going to have that and hear that from these particular monastics again and again. Other things might help for a while, but in the end, does it really have the flavor of freedom? Does it really have the taste of Dhamma? Or is it just another entanglement? You have to ask yourself this.
Great.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Ooh, and Janiki has a public service announcement. So Bhante G in Virginia, Bhikkhuni Dr. Niroda in Australia, Bhante Samhita in Letchworth, UK, all conduct classes for children online.
Great.
See? Great. Wonderful. And Bhavani says very nice things about us, and then says, why are the names Empty Cloud Monastery and Anukampa Bhikkhuni Monastery for your monasteries? Would you like to start,
Yeah,
Anukampa?
okay. So first of all, Anukampa Bhikkhuni project is not yet a monastery. It's a project, and I use the word project because I knew that it would take some time. Bhikkhuni is obviously because this is the missing part of the dual Sangha and the fourfold assembly. So we wanted to highlight that we are giving women finally an opportunity to train for full liberation through the full training provided by the Buddha, like given as a gift, as you beautifully said, by the Buddha. And because it's the most trustworthy vehicle, you know, it's the one that he prescribed, and he said it's the fastest way. Of course, the bhikkhu training for monks. And the word Anukampa was a word dear to my heart. Partly it came to my awareness through one of my teachers, Ajahn Sucitto, who I did consider quite a key Kalyanamitta on the path. I've not been to his teachings of late, and I'm more inclined now towards really sutta-based teachings and teachers who bring those alive for me. But the way he described it as a kind of sympathetic resonance, or a kind of compassion that really trembles with the suffering of others, but not trembles with fear, but trembles in a way that wants to then do something about that and bring forth qualities of kindness and compassion to alleviate the suffering. And Anukampa was the quality that actually motivated the Buddha himself to teach. You know, he said that he taught out of Anukampa for all beings, basically, for their benefit and for their happiness. And so it feels to me as though what we're doing with the project is definitely motivated by compassion, because there's a lot of suffering involved where women cannot get the same opportunities as men to ordain and to, you know, take the path laid down by the Buddha and walk it to its completion. I think this is something that might be hard for people to understand if they haven't had such a strong calling towards monastic life. But the thing is, when something's never been there, we don't know how many people's heart is going to leap towards that. You know, I ordained in Myanmar in 2004 and then 2006. Since 2006, I've been in robes. And for me, the renunciation was complete. It was a full renunciation from the heart. And yet it was only a few years into my monastic life that I realized that beyond the monastery, there was no structure, there was no training system that was consistent for me, you know, globally, internationally. And I mean, there was no question of wanting to take the full ordination, but it just hadn't appeared in my life and in my mind as an option. But when I first heard that there were bhikkhunis training and practicing in Australia with my teacher, Ajahn Brahm, I mean, my heart just leapt. I thought if I could get the opportunity, you know, I just leaped for that. So I think, you know, the mission of bringing the training path laid down by the Buddha for women goes hand in hand with anukampa, with compassion. So that's why we chose that name.
Great, thank you. And Empty Cloud Monastery, Bhante, do you want to share the reason why?
Yeah, so the monastery that we're currently in used to be a Catholic monastery, and it was called St. Cloud Monastery, which is it's actually in a neighborhood called St. Cloud. So the patron saint of this area was called St. Cloud. So we wanted to keep a similar name, but something with a more distinctly Buddhist flair. So the word empty cloud, to me, it brings up, well, first off, the recollection of emptiness, that ultimately all things are insubstantial and therefore not worth clinging to, not worth grasping at. There's no point in attachment because ultimately it's impossible to attach to anything. And cloud, to me, it brings up one of the Chinese names for a Buddhist monk, which is a Buddhist monk is called Clouds and Water. Because just like clouds and water just drift and flow from place to place without sticking anywhere. In the same way, a Buddhist monastic, we just drift and float around. Like we're not, as keep coming up in the Dhammapada verses we've been looking at lately, we have no home anywhere. We have no abode anywhere. We're trying to have a mind which floats as freely as the clouds, which flows as freely as water. So that's what I think about when I hear Empty Cloud Monastery.
Great, thank you, Bhante. And another public service announcement, Toronto Mahamevana also has an online children's program. I believe Bhante G's I also mentioned already. Oh, and Venerable Prasanna is tuning in to say hello.
Lovely.
Hello, Venerable.
I love it when other monastics join in.
Yeah. And Ian says, hello, Venerables. As always, thank you for offering these talks. How did you decide on Theravada? I've been practicing Zen for about 12 years now and studying Theravada for 6. I've been feeling some doubt if Zen is the right school for me because of the precepts. For example, being told killing, lying, etc. is okay sometimes. Every time this has caused my life crisis, I've sided with the Theravada side of things, that they are to be strictly held. Creativity might just need to be used. Well, obviously, I'm biased. I will start from that. But how did I pick Theravada? Well, there is definitely a karmic affinity there because the first monastery I went to was in the Thai forest tradition of Ajahn Chah, and I just loved it. It was love at first sight. The second monastery I went to was in the Theravada forest tradition of Sri Lanka, Bhante Gunaratana's monastery in West Virginia, and I loved it. So I love the practice. I love the Vinaya. There was just so many different things that just really spoke to me, probably, from past lives. But when it comes to the Dhamma, Bhante Sudarshan and I started Buddhist Insights 7 years ago now. 6, 7, I'm losing track. Coming up on 7. And I have to say that, we had monastics from all traditions. So, Theravada and Mahayana, but also Vajrayana, which is Mahayana anyway, but they like to say it's different. And it is, in fact, a little bit different. And I have to say that, when the Theravada monastics were here, I was like, yeah, only Theravada is true. Like everything else is a bunch of nonsense. And yes, especially the forest tradition is great. And the sutta is wonderful. Only the Pali Canon is true. And then, I would meet the Mahayana monastics. And I'm like, actually, they, really have compassion, not like those Hinayana. I think I have to practice in this way. They truly, this bodhisattva way of doing things is the right way. And then I would go to the Tibetan monastics would come, and I would go like, no, actually, these are the only ones who understand the Dhamma. The other ones are all beginners. And then I would go back to Theravada and the same thing. Oh, no, actually, I've forgotten this about Theravada. So after a while, I started laughing about my mind because I was like, oh, you're just, whatever you're listening to, in terms of Dhamma, your mind starts, it's just a beautiful Dhamma. So you start obsessing about it. So then I stopped choosing in a way. And I chose this form because actually I really love precepts. So that was the reason why I wanted to ordain. As a lay person, I took first 5 precepts. And I was like, oh, this is pretty great. Then 8 precepts. Oh, this is really great. And then, and then I took 10 precepts and 311. And yeah, it just gets better. I know. And then I understood why, some of the, bhikkhu monasteries, they add, there are some like monasteries in Myanmar where they have thousands, millions perhaps of precepts. They go to commentaries and commentaries. I'm like, I'm starting to get the hang of it, 311 is not really that much, you're like keeping up with the Joneses. So yeah, obviously there's more of an emphasis on the Vinaya in the Theravada tradition usually, or at least in the canonical interpretation of the Vinaya. So just feels better, it really works for my mind. And obviously the suttas, the Pali suttas, are my first love, and they're always the ones that I go back to. So I guess, personally, the other traditions, so Mahayana and Tibetan Buddhism, I always kind of relate to it as my commentary, because actually I don't really like the commentaries in the Theravada tradition or the later things. And then I actually like that about, all the other traditions make me understand better the teachings that are in the Pali Canon, or give that perspective. So if you feel a little bit uncomfortable with the interpretation of the Zen school that you're going to, you don't have to necessarily reject everything that they were doing, but you can actually take the core of the Theravada practice that you have and integrate it. Whatever is not in contradiction with Theravada, the precepts, you can use it as frosting on the cake. Frosting is always good, right? And I don't know if the venerables want to answer.
Yeah, well, one thing I might just say is that I started in the Zen school. So I practiced in Zen for 5 years, including 2 years in a monastery. Actually, the main reason why I got into Theravada was because I wanted full ordination. And it just isn't an option in Japanese Buddhism. So I started looking elsewhere. And I discovered that in the Zen world, if you want full ordination, then you mostly go through either China or Korea, which basically means you need to learn either Chinese or Korean. And if you learn Korean, you still have to learn Chinese anyway, because all the Mahayana scriptures are in Chinese. But at the time, I wasn't willing to commit to learning Chinese. So then the only real option for full ordination was through the Theravada tradition. And also I appreciated that the Theravada school has a lot of different meditation methods, whereas the Zen school is, you have 1 or 2. That's it. 2 is maximum. That's if you're lucky. Whereas in Theravada, there's dozens. So I liked having many options to play with. And also I appreciate the emphasis on returning to the original scriptures that's present in the Theravada school. That's something I really value. But I often think, if it had been easy for me to get full ordination within the Zen tradition, this was a dozen years ago, I might have stayed. Even back in 2009 or something, I would have stayed. I don't think I would have left. I actually really appreciate the Zen teachings. I really appreciate Zen meditation practice. And actually, whatever teacher is telling you that it's okay to be flexible with the precepts, I'm just going to flat out tell you they're wrong. Because actually there's tons and tons of highly respected Zen teachers across the board who will tell you that the 5 precepts are unbreakable. These are not things that you can play with. So they're often pretty flexible with the monastic rules, but the core moral principles of not killing, stealing, cheating on your partner, lying, using intoxicants, the good Zen teachers will tell you that these are not to be broken. So I think it's more that the teachers you're going to, maybe they themselves don't like precepts. Maybe that's why they're saying what they're saying, because that's definitely not a central tenet of Zen practice. So I might recommend, by the way, going into the Chan schools, especially the schools out of Taiwan. If you want some serious Zen practice, but that believes in the importance of precepts, and which really takes the traditional Buddhist teaching seriously, look at Taiwan. Look at the Chan schools from Taiwan. So Dharma Drum is the most accessible in English, but the others are also quite good.
Yeah, and there's definitely no contradiction in terms of sila with any of those schools. So you would definitely not have that problem.
Yeah.
And Venerable Chanda?
Yeah, so I think I already said a bit about how I came to the path. So I guess I never looked back because the practice worked, and that was my entry point into the Dhamma. So the practice I was doing, which included observing my mind and the sensations in the body and noticing their impermanent nature, had real transformative effects in my life. I found I had a lot more equanimity in dealing with various situations outside. I had less of a need for stimulating the senses. I was a lot more contented in all kinds of different situations. I found that my virtue naturally purified, even to the point where I stopped listening to my Led Zeppelin, which was my big first passion in life, from teens anyway. Before that, I guess it was food or something. And so it was just remarkable to me because I hadn't tried to change. It was just these changes were coming by default, simply through having sat and observed my mind and seeing some of the ways that I build suffering, some of the ways that basically through craving, right? But also through reacting to our experience with aversion, with wanting to reject or push it away. And I realized that the problem wasn't in the external world, it was inside myself. And then I think the thing that gave me the conviction that I was really in contact with the Buddha's teachings is that whatever I would experience, I would then find was spoken about and elucidated in a lot more clarity and depth in the suttas. And then whenever I'd read the suttas, that would open up new avenues of practice for myself. So it felt to me that the theory and the practice were very much in harmony. And the more I would practice, the more I'd be interested in the theory, the more I would read, the more deep the practice would go. So that gave me a lot of confidence. And I have this real sense of confidence and devotion towards the suttas and a trust that we're getting the teachings that are closest to what the Buddha himself taught. So I've never really looked back, and I'm not sure that I'd be patient enough to learn Chinese and Korean or to go through all these rituals that people go through in Tibetan Buddhism. And I'm not saying there's no purpose for that. I'm sure there's a very strong purpose for that. And it prepares the mind incredibly well for the meditation. But personally, I was suffering. It's like in the Buddhist suttas, it says it's like your turban's on fire or your hair is on fire. And I just wanted to put that fire out. So I wanted to go straight into the meditation and understand what was going on in my mind. And now you can see that I don't even have any hair, but the fire is subsiding. So yeah, I'm going to continue on this path.
Sadhu. Yeah, we'll also just add that actually one really great thing about the Theravada form is, once again, when you're reading the suttas, that it's just so relatable. Like, going pindapada, doing certain practices, they're just so, like you can feel exactly like 2,500 years ago in ancient India. There's not too much separation, and since my faith is actually very much based on the Dhamma, on the suttas, it really makes my mind elate a lot. And this is for Venerable Chanda. Aya Chanda, given your diverse experience, would you please comment on the differences between the Burmese practice of Dhamma and the Thai tradition that you're currently within? In particular, would you care to comment on the emphasis on Jhana and the type of Jhana? Thank you and kind regards.
Okay. I think with different meditation practices, they can often seem to vary a lot in the beginning when you start to practice, but later on when you get more proficient in any method or technique, the nature of the mind is such that you'll probably come to a very similar place. So my entry point, as you know, is the Vipassana tradition as taught or inherited from Sayagyi Ubakin, and I'm pretty confident that that has very powerful results. I also know that people in that tradition do get into deep samadhi, even though they're usually focusing on the sensations of the breath. Still, sometimes the mind can slip into deep jhanas. And in Burma, as far as I know, at least in the tradition I was trained in, there was no dilution of what a jhana is. It was very clearly something that you entered through the nimitta of the mind, through the light that can arise in the mind. Some teachers also say that that can present itself as a feeling-based nimitta, so a sense of softness, but it's very much in the mental realm. And I have heard that there are other traditions in Burma that talk about some kind of vipassana jhana. And I think the main reason for this is that the samadhi can get very strong when it's focused on, or when it's perceiving arising and passing away at any of the sense doors, but for me it was primarily the body sense. So the samadhi can be very strong, and perhaps it's as strong as the samadhi of jhanas, like sama samadhi, but it's not the same thing, because the object is actually changing, and so it cannot give the same stability of mind. So what I realized was that although my samadhi was pretty strong in terms of vipassana, there wasn't this sense of things ceasing, like completely. There was still some kind of vibration happening. So it came to a point in my practice that I came in contact with another teacher who'd been through the same process as me and then gone to the Patak tradition to learn jhana based on anapana. And he made the distinction of observing the breath as kind of in its ultimate nature, I mean ultimate in inverted commas, but in the sense of the sensations, the arising and passing experience of the breath, and the breath as a concept, so just breath as breath. And it actually took me several years to shift my perception to see a breath simply as a breath and to get a different kind of stability with that. Now I'm losing track of the question a little bit. I think you're asking about the difference between the jhanas. As far as I understand, jhanas as taught by the Buddha, they are usually taking one simple and single object, and the mind basically becomes unified with that. And the way that my teacher Ajahn Brahm teaches the jhanas is that at that point, the five senses actually turn off, if you like. I mean, they are actually still there. It's not like you've died, but the mind becomes so powerful and so one-pointed that your experience is just within the realm of mind. And the whole point of practicing jhanas is not to get some special attainment or some special experience. It's just what happens when the hindrances start to cease and when the mind becomes really, really settled inside. So for me, I'm still working on my samadhi, or let's say the process of samadhi is still a process. But I'm learning more and more about letting go, about getting out of the way, about right effort, how to balance the energies of the mind. And I find that I feel that I'm practicing the path a little bit more fully than I was before. So in a sense, the Vipassana offered a bit of Anapana, then a lot of Vipassana, or say body contemplation, and then a bit of metta practice. So I feel like that was like doing a bachelor's degree, so you get a bit of each. And then at a point I reached a plateau and I thought, okay, now I want to specialize a little bit, do my MA in Anapana, or do a little bit more in the metta practice. So sometimes it depends on the inclination of your mind, but basically, I mean, we all need to develop the Eightfold Noble Path. This is the main point, right? And that includes samasati, but also sama samadhi. So yeah, people will teach jhana samadhi differently, but try not to be too eager to label your experience as jhana, because you might be stopping short of the actual deep experience. It doesn't matter if you can't be sure that whether you've already experienced jhanas or not. It's much better to just keep practicing and keep, reminding yourself there's something yet to experience that I haven't experienced. Just keep going deeper. So I don't know, that was a bit of but hopefully some of that made sense.
Wonderful. Thank you, Venerable. And Mary was asking about your story before you ordained, but I think you answered that already. And Santa was saying in terms of all the female ordination and representation in the suttas. I agree, by the way, makes no sense with the rest of the teaching. Just asking. Yes. And Sud says, I was reading the sutta called Grass and Sticks. It's about not having any start to universe. When he talks about collecting sticks, one's mother and mother's mother, is he referring to one's mom or previous consciousness? Would you like to address that?
Oh gosh, I'd have to see the specific sutta to see what you're talking about. But I think if I recall correctly, he's saying that if you gathered up all the sticks in the forest, then that still wouldn't be as many as the number of mothers that you've had. So he's talking about in previous lives as well. So like in this life, you've had a mother and a mother's mother. Actually, usually mother's mother. Yeah. It's usually how it goes. And a mother's mother's mother and so on. But he's saying that you've had so many lives, and each of those lives you've had a mother and a mother's mother, that even if you collected all the sticks in a forest, it still wouldn't be as many as all the mothers that you've had. So he's just pointing out to how many lives we've lived. So the Buddha in the suttas, he gave many, many similes to try to communicate just how impossibly ancient the universe is, just how impossibly ancient existence is, and just how many countless lives we've lived in all different shapes and forms. So he uses similes because similes are a way that we can start to understand. It's usually more effective than just giving a giant number. Like even the word infinite is kind of problematic because it's just an abstract idea. But when the Buddha says something like, the amount of tears you've shed is more than what would fill all the great oceans, we're like, oh, that's a lot of tears. So it gives you a sense of the sheer enormity of all the lives that we've lived. Yeah, fundamentally, the Buddha says that there's no beginning. So existence within samsara is beginningless. No matter how far back you look, you're never going to find a beginning. You never find a starting point. Yeah.
Thank you, Bante. And more sadhus. Wow, Venerable Chanda, the empty cloud. Okay. Kumu says, Venerables, of the 152 suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya, is it possible to have a list of those that are the key suttas that are extremely beneficial to learn? Say a list of 75, maybe, of the 152. Well, there is Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's anthology in the Buddha's words, where he has actually done this incredible work for us. That was the first, actually, sutta book that I read, and that's very connected to the other question of the other person. That kind of really did it, because I was always the uninstructed worldling in the
me.
Yeah, I would read the suttas, and it's like the uninstructed worldling, and I would totally not identify with the uninstructed worldling. Would do X, Y, and Z, and then I'm like, oh, what's wrong with that? And then the noble disciple would do something else, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm never the noble disciple. I'm always the uninstructed worldling. And I guess it really did something to my self-esteem that prompted me. But yeah, he collected all the core teachings of the Buddha right there. He's incredible. He's such an incredible being, that Bhikkhu Bodhi. He also officially converted me to Buddhism, because I went to a retreat where he gave an overview of the path, and yeah, so consistent. So like you I was like, yeah, I mean, I can't see any flaw. I better like give it a shot before I basically shoot myself, in the sense of in sense of bad karma. Okay. Anyway, so check
Figuratively.
out
Shoot yourself in the foot.
Her sense of humor comes out.
And she's tired.
Anyway, so
could I add one thing to that?
Yes,
which
please.
is just to say that although it's really nice to think about how many suttas you've read and want to be thorough, don't make it only intellectual. Sometimes just open the suttas and see if something speaks to your heart. Because what I tend to find is I might have in mind reading a certain sutta, and then maybe I look in a footnote, or maybe something else comes to mind, and I end up looking in the index, and suddenly the process carries itself. It becomes a kind of exploration that's more based on the heart. It's like speaking to me. I'm getting joy from it. And so one sutta leads to the next. So try not just to see it as an intellectual activity, but something that should be feeding the heart.
I mean, also to say when I heard this question, my first thought actually was to just give you a list of the names of the 152 suttas. But then I was like, well, actually, realistically, if I had to, I would probably say the first 20 or so are really, really good, really important suttas. And I've also always really enjoyed the last 50. The last 50 are full of some really profound, interesting texts. So if you really, really don't want to read the whole thing, which why not? Then read the first 20 and the last 50.
Yeah. And number 60.
What's number 60?
Apanaka.
Just read the whole Majjhima Nikaya. Because this is the problem. If I actually started going through the table of contents,
the first at least 10 are always taught in Perth every year, because they're considered like Ajahn Brahm wants all the lay people and novices to learn those really well as a sort of basis, a foundation in Buddhism. So,
that's great.
Yeah. So I think it's good to start, with the first 10, 20, and then see what happens.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I'd say the first 20, because also 11 to 20 have a lot of my favorites. Madhupindika Sutta, Vitakka Santana Sutta.
This is very good, yeah.
Oh,
19 and 20.
We have many questions and very little time
Oh,
left.
okay, we
so
should get going.
Maybe we'll respond only 1% each.
Okay.
Could the Venerables please share some of your favorite very moments or breakthroughs? Maybe we'll pass this to Venerable Chanda, since we answered this very often.
That's really hard to say. I mean, favorite. I try not to preference my meditation, honestly, because some of the most pleasurable or so-called insightful experiences maybe give insight for a while, but not very long. Other very difficult experiences can give insights or can bring about changes in my life that last for a very long time. So my practice is not really to sort of get hung on particular experiences. It's more about developing contentment. So I would probably say it's the moments when I've experienced the deepest contentment and real sense that whatever is arising, whatever I have right now is enough, really, truly enough. And that contentment comes from deep within, so that I'm not any more interested in the sight, sound, smells, taste, and touch. And my mind starts to incline inside. So, I mean, I had a very lovely Vasa a couple of years ago in Oxford, just on my own. And I sat very comfortably on a chair. I was telling her, Soma, who's hurt her ankle, giving her a bit of encouragement to sit on a chair if need be. And I was just developing the practice of happy to be here, right where I am in my mind. And it actually did get quite deep. So I try not to really single out particular experiences.
Great, thank you. And Venerable Notan says, we see that nowadays many monks refuse or leave monastic life and become lay people. Even some of them are already middle-aged. So what should we do as a member of the Sangha to keep them in monastic life? Actually, I come from Italy, where, Catholic monasticism, oddly enough, does not allow monastics to leave the order. It's actually really harmful. People want to leave and all sorts of, bad things happen. If someone needs to leave the monastic order, should leave the monastic order. That is actually what preserves the faith, both of the people who are actually monastics and of the lay followers who see monastics that really want to be in the robes and are enthusiastic. But, you know, sometimes there is too much of an emphasis on the clerical, you know, sort of role, and it can become, monastic life can then become a bit of a job. So I would say that definitely, you know, obviously we kind of always will have to do, if we take these robes on, how to do with certain clerical duties. We have to remember why we have become monastics. And Buddhism is not just, you know, a religion like anyone else. Like, it is a religion that needs to be practiced. It is a religion that leads towards a cessation of suffering. And when we come to the awareness of suffering, yeah, we can really work on it to remove it. So yeah, studying, but not as an intellectual exercise, you know, as Venerable Chanda was saying, absolutely, like really like understanding, investigating these teachings. We like to do it with other monastics too. That strengthens the faith, you know, it makes so much Dhamma sukha. You're like, yeah, this is great, this is wonderful. You clarify the wrong view, and you keep on nourishing the mind with the right intention. And then practicing the Vinaya. Otherwise, it becomes this kind of like weird thing where, you know, we're only using some precepts and some other precepts we don't. Obviously, not, you know, being too crazy and neurotic about it either. So always that it's supportive to the Dhamma practice, but also not just throwing it out of the out of the window altogether. So all of these things create, I think, the ideal conditions to inspire people and to stay. Well, either to stay in the robes if they're going in a moment of crisis, or to get into the robes and keep moving in. So yeah, I think better few but good than a lot that All right, and John says hello. From Australia. Oh, good to see you. I'm wondering why bhikkhunis take more ordination vows than bhikkhus. I think I kind of addressed that. Yeah. Can you share some reflections on embodying compassion for oneself and others? This is a question from Rick. Any of the two venerables, since I just spoke?
Yeah, I mean, just broadly speaking, constantly look for things you can do to alleviate the sufferings of others. So one of the problems is that if we think of compassion as just being a mind state, then we miss out on the fact that compassion needs to influence our actions. I've known a lot of people who talk about compassion, but then they actually don't care the slightest bit about the people in their lives, and they don't do anything to help other people. So actually look for things you can do to help people out. This makes compassion much more deep and much more alive.
Great, thank you, Bante. And Sud asks, what does it mean to practice sati sampajana in daily life outside of meditation? How does this apply to a lay person in a regular everyday life?
Okay. It's just about remembering the Buddha's instructions, first of all, remembering to be mindful, because we can think about mindfulness, but if we forget to be mindful, then it's very difficult to practice. So we can do this at any point in time. I mean, sati sampajanya together is more than just awareness. It also carries an element of wisdom and knowing what's appropriate in a given situation. So it's learning to act in wisdom. Yeah, so we can be aware, obviously, of the contact at any of the sense doors. For example, you know, when you're doing something physical like washing the dishes, you can be aware of the sensation of the hot water or the warm water on your hands. You can come back into a moment of presence. You know, you can come back into the present moment and notice, you know, that your mind was lost for a while. It was going into the past, going into the future. But also to remember the purpose of what you're doing. So if you are washing those dishes, you also try to do it with kindness. You try to develop joy around it, thinking I'm doing a service either for myself to keep my house tidy or for someone else who then doesn't have to wash the dishes. So keeping these two things together in everything we do is really, really helpful. And any moment of even realizing that you haven't been aware is a moment of mindfulness, because you've remembered to come back to the path. So, and I think it's something that just develops naturally the more you have your regular sitting practice. So it's about taking that time twice a day, as I was saying in the beginning. Maybe if you can, first thing in the morning, even before you have your breakfast, and then sometime in the evening. It's like learning to put the brakes on the mind and just come back to an embodied sense of the present moment. Just taking a moment to collect the mind. And from there, you'll find that you develop this habit, and from time to time, the brakes will come on. If you're about to sort of shout at somebody, you'll suddenly remember, oh, how do I feel right now? My feet are on the ground, there's a burning sensation, maybe there's heat. And you also remember the appropriate thing to do is to respond, perhaps not with anger, but with compassion instead. So that's just a few tips.
Wonderful, thank you. And Steve, sorry I had missed your question, says he's from the UK, Petersfield, and they say, a friend recently committed suicide a few days ago. Any advice for dealing with it? Actually, Venerable Chanda, would you like to share some words on that as well?
Yeah, I'm guessing that when you talk about dealing with it, you're first of all talking about how to relate to your own loss, shock, suffering, grief that you're experiencing now. And I think the short answer would be with a lot of loving kindness and compassion, really honoring your feelings without getting swept away, but not trying to push them aside, not trying to intellectualize them, but giving them space to just be felt, and to acknowledge that, yeah, right now this is really difficult, and allow yourself to grieve. I think it's also important because obviously in Buddhism we have such a strong emphasis on not harming either others or ourselves, to then start worrying for the person who's committed suicide that they're going to go to a terrible place, maybe they'll go to hell. And this can really compound the suffering that you feel, and also not do that person very many favors either. Because that person may have made so many good choices in their life. They may have been a wonderful friend or brother, sister, daughter, son. They may have just had one moment of despair where they lost their mindfulness and they did something that obviously had not completely permanent consequences, but pretty permanent consequences for this life. But at the same time, they are carrying a lot of good karma too. And if you can somehow try to reflect on that person's qualities, reflect on your own qualities, your own goodness, and share some of that with them, then that might help to carry them on to a better rebirth. So I really like this story, and I'll just say it in brief, that Ajahn Brahm gives, because I don't have a better story. And it's of a young man, I think a teenager, who committed suicide in Perth. And his parents were, I think, Sri Lankan Buddhists, and came to him very concerned, saying, well, what's going to happen now to him? And Ajahn Brahm started asking questions about the exams he was about to sit. And they were thinking, what's he doing? He's gone crazy. But he started asking, in the exam that your son was about to sit, how many sections were there? Like, how many papers? Oh, I don't know, about 3 or 4. Okay, and in each section, how many questions were there? I don't know, maybe 15, 20 questions. So what happens if, this person answers this paper and answers these questions perfectly? Every question they get right, or they get reasonably correct. But on the first question, they really stuff up. They get a wrong answer. Do they fail the exam? And then the parents realized, oh, yeah, this is what he was coming at. This is what he was pointing to. Isn't that a wonderful thing to hold on to? And I think, we never know the destination of another being. We can never fathom the pain that they experienced at that moment, or the pain that their family are now going through. But certainly if we can try to perceive it in a more hopeful way, then we can hopefully share some of the goodness of our lives with that person and give them a better chance to move on. So.
Great, thank you, Venerable. And that was the last question. Is there anything from the live audience for the last 5 minutes?
I have a small question. So what's the difference between forest monks and non-forest monks?
Well, forest monks live in the forest, and non-forest monks don't live in the forest. That's the difference. But broadly speaking, so this distinction is mostly made by forest monks, by the way. And usually the distinction is that, broadly speaking, forest monks tend to follow very strict Vinaya standards, and they also tend to do a lot of meditation. But there's also plenty of non-forest monks who also follow strict Vinaya and do a lot of meditation. So this is just broad generalizations. And also you'll find forest monks who are not so into Vinaya and not so into meditation. You'll find that too. But as a broad generalization, if people are making that distinction and using those words, then usually they mean someone who has a very strict Vinaya practice and does a lot of meditation. So when you take that definition, then you'll actually find that some forest monks live in city places. So it's, but generally speaking, people who like to do a lot of meditation tend to like to live in quiet places. So usually you'll find them in outside the cities. It's a short answer.
Great.
Is
All
that it?
right. Yes,
Okay.
that's all. Okay, so we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu,
Sadhu, sadhu. All right. Well, actually, just a short announcement. The next monk chat, actually in February, we'll have 2 monk chats. This one upcoming, and after 2 weeks by the Bhikkhunis at Karuna Vihara, so Ayasantusikanaya Chittananda, and the other 2 weeks instead with Bhante Sumitra, that some of you may remember from our past year at Empty Cloud Monastery. He was one of the resident bhikkhus here. So that's what's going to happen. And next Thursday also, Bhante Sanatha Vihari and Bhante Sudaso has had some requests on instant translations from Pali Suttas. So he will be offering that before he enters retreat. And then there will be also some blasts from the past during this month of February, because we will be tuning off a little bit, although there will still be some live streams from other monastics, just not from the monastics at Empty Cloud. So keep on tuning in, and we'll also have always during the regular hours there will be something coming up. Also Bhikkhu Bodhi's retreats from the past. So very good to very good stuff. So looking forward to seeing you all on the channel. May you all be well, happy, and peaceful, and may all good things come to you. And I wanted to